Hi, everybody. My name is Joseph Robbins, and I'm the Program Manager for Disabilities Inclusion here at the URJ. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar. This is the third webinar in the URJ-Ruderman High Holidays Inclusion Learning Series. We are thrilled to have all of you with us. This webinar is being led by Matan Koch, who is a man of many talents, and I will let him introduce himself in a moment. I'm happy to hand the controls over to Matan and let him start. Thank you all for being here with us, and after Matan's presentation, we'll have a Q&A session with Matan where everybody will be able to ask any questions that they have. Thanks very much.
This is, as Joe mentioned, the next in a series. So my presentation to you today is going to be more agadic than halachic. I'm going to tell you some stories and bring some points in the hope that the earlier webinars, which are recorded and you can get to, gave you some nuts and bolts material on inclusion. And I want to, or have been asked to paint through the lens of experience some of the things that I've learned about it. So I grew up in a small town in Connecticut, and so my first experience with, also I was the rabbi's kid, so I didn't have to wait in line. My first experience with lines at the high holidays was when I moved to New York City. Let me set the stage. It's Erev Rosh Hashanah, and I arrive at my shul, and there's a line around the block because that happens at big synagogues, and one of the ushers shows me to the line. Another usher then comes to me and says, "Oh, you don't have to wait in the line. Let me push you forward," and recommends that I skip it. I can't really figure out which I should do because I've now got two different ideas from two different ushers. And so I wait on the line only to get into the synagogue and find out that essentially I was supposed to skip the line so they could get me seated. At another similar synagogue, I had just gotten seated by one usher when another usher came by and told me to sit somewhere else. Shortly thereafter, after I moved, the first usher came in and told me to ask me why I had moved. Now, why do I start an ostensible webinar on high holiday inclusion by telling such strange stories? The answer is they're not strange stories. They're endemic of something that's the first of the lessons that I want to take from my experience, which can be right from your first service, which is that whatever your policies are, make sure that everyone knows them. And make sure that everyone knows them not only because it's kind of funny, but because one of the biggest barriers to inclusion is for those of us that show up and just want to have a prayer experience, but don't really know what we're supposed to do. And we're tossed around. And we, ultimately spend our entire time wondering if we've done something wrong. And so I'm not here, because you had a previous one, to tell you what to do. I'm here to tell my story so you can learn from it. Again, it's weird because I can't see your faces, but my goal today is that I'm going to have a number of stories like this. Simple stories, quick stories, not exciting stories, just stories that will make you go, and will help you think of some precepts to keep in mind of inclusion. And so my hope is that after I've done this for about 25 minutes, a half hour, whatever it takes, you'll then ask me questions about the ideas, about concerns, about ways I made you think. That's, after all, what stories are about. They're to make us think about the implications. So without further ado, on to another story, is roughly following the order of a high holiday day. So this is after I've arrived at services, there's been evening services, there's been morning services, and it's time for Tashlich. Now, my synagogue growing up was near a river, and that river wasn't accessible. And every year I sat at the synagogue while they traipsed down a muddy riverbank, I just waited. I couldn't participate. I don't know how much I wanted to go traipsing through the mud, but I couldn't. And I was always struck with the following question. Why? First of all, as I think most of us know, tashlich is a custom, not an actual prescribed ritual of Rosh Hashanah. Secondly, even if it were rigidly halachically prescribed, I, for one, am a proud member of the Reform movement. I think we're running a URJ webinar, so I imagine most of my audience is. We change stuff in meaningful ways when it doesn't work by modern values. I wonder every time I reflect on those times since Sing of the Shul, did our tashlich have to be at that river? Could we have cast away our sins in a way that we could have all done it together? In case we're not clear, this isn't a lesson about tashlich. It's a lesson about our ritual practice. From the first minutes of Erev Rosh Hashanah until the last Akafa of Simchat Torah, this season is full of ritual. Look at each of our rituals and ask the following questions. Who is being excluded by what we're doing? How can we change it? And how can we make it more inclusive? I think common ones will include pre-fasts and break-fasts for Yom Kippur, so often held at the same three congregants' houses because they always have been, without regard to whether someone can get in. Now, as you're making these changes, it's important to try to make them while preserving the character of the holiday, but it's also important to preserve the holiday experience for your participants. As I said in my blog post, it's about including everyone in the experience of awe, which is, after all, what we want to do. Nowhere is this better than described than my experience with wheelchair sections at the high holidays. There was a synagogue where I spent the high holidays for a few years that had a fantastic wheelchair section in some regards. I was practically on top of the bima. Gone were my childhood fears of not being able to see the delightful shade of red that the shofar blower would turn as he tried for the long notes at the end of the service. Unfortunately, this elevated perch was at a designated section which kept me far from everyone with whom I might have actually wanted to share the holiday. I'm sure that I could have brought a designated family member, but unfortunately I was solo because the nature of young adult Jews is that we're sometimes spread out from our families. The problem is that most of the people in the special wheelchair section were, 3 times a year Jews, and so all of my friends from the synagogue weren't there. There's no easy solution to this, but what I often tell people as we're thinking about settling people in is perhaps to think of 2 options. One with the best view and one that allows community. The bigger lesson is to try to look at things like even helpful things, wheelchair sections, quiet rooms and things like that, and say, not only have we done them, which hopefully other webinars have covered, but are we preserving the experience? Are we giving different parts of the experience? The next item by story is what I would say is defending the experience. There's no defending the experience. Another anecdote's in order. So when I was young and living in New York, I used to hop around for high holidays. It's one of the reasons why I have so many examples. And honestly, one time I went to a synagogue that's always very crowded. And to be fair, they had trouble finding a place to fit me in. But they did. They had a wheelchair section. This is why it fits under my loose segment on wheelchair sections. And so I got seated, and it wasn't a great seat. It was by the door, but hey, at least I was in there. I was praying, just doing my thing. And all of a sudden, an usher comes by and asks me, can I move a little bit so that her son, who is able-bodied, can set up a folding chair and have a place to sit. The problem is that by moving a little bit, all of a sudden I was actually sitting out in the hallway, staring at a post, no longer in the room, so that this particular usher could have a space for her son that arrived late. Now, this story is a bit of an aberration. I don't think there are ushers waiting around every corner to urge people out of their accessible seats so that their kid can have a spot. But I think it is important to train everyone that's going to be a part of accommodation practice what it is you're going to be doing, so that all the people that are doing the hard work of managing the legitimate circus that is the high holidays will actually be able to be helpful in a way that makes sense and can help people make a meaningful experience. I'm going to assume that something similar could happen just because no one understood why I was getting the coveted last space by the door. So my example so far, and again, I'm sorry of the odd broken narrative, this is just a function of the fact that we can't be interactive. My examples so far have focused on physical impairments, and I'm not going to focus too much on sensory impairments, mostly because when Edie and Joe approached me about doing this, they approached me about speaking from personal experience, and while I am a person of several different disabilities, I don't have any sensory-related disabilities. I'm hoping that we can either direct you to materials or other people's experiences that can help. But I do want to talk a little bit of my experience of high holiday inclusion as a person who also experiences mental illness. So I developed an anxiety disorder, true story, on Erev Rosh Hashanah 5752. In my newly vulnerable state, to hear my father, who was the rabbi, intone about who by sword and who by beast, who by hunger and who by thirst, who by strangling and who by stoning, who shall see ripe age and who shall not, grass that must wither, shattered urns, etc., was absolutely overwhelming. I think it's moderately overwhelming on a normal day, and surely as a newly minted person with an anxiety problem, it was quite overwhelming. I left the sanctuary in one of my first panic attacks and was attended to by a friendly congregant who was a doctor, not because there was a plan for the kids having panic attacks, but because he was a nice guy that saw me only a bit. But the learning from the story is this. Rosh Hashanah is actually kind of a tough time to have a disability. For people with anxiety, the liturgy can make you feel very afraid. For people with depression, the liturgy can make you feel helpless. Even people with physical disabilities, especially acquired ones, may find themselves wondering if they should feel that they were smote in some previous year because they had not been well written into the book of life. Now, I don't really recommend a wholesale change to our liturgy and customs. It really isn't practical. Besides, if you eliminate fate and judgment from Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, what's left? I think having safe spaces is a good thought for people that are overwhelmed, but even more than that, I think it's acknowledging that this is a time that raises a lot of thoughts and concerns and questions, and it'd be great to think about if in the weeks leading up to Rosh Hashanah or the weeks after, there are ways to have discussions where all of the different people that might be troubled or marginalized by parts of our liturgy, and I don't even want to say that that's limited to disability, but necessarily to lots of folks that have questions or concerns based on the themes, have an opportunity to discuss it, have an opportunity to wrestle with it, have an opportunity to contextualize it in a way that feels good. Again, just from personal experience, that is that overwhelmed kid, but as someone who also sits there trying to figure out. Really, the last sort of part of that progression is what I'll call a word on ending. It's funny. On a normal Shabbat, we sit and we linger, we chat over oneg or what have you. Even on Rosh Hashanah, where there might be some oneg, people tend to run out right away. On Yom Kippur, where we're fasting, everyone's really on the way out. And so it's strange, but if you're someone who moves a little slowly, who has more trouble getting out, it might be that the person that is looking out for you left before you got out there. So the hardest part is, even at those moments when you're running for your meals, end by thinking about folks that are there. So what are the themes of my stories? A couple of basic themes. Number one, we want to look at all of the wonderful preparations that we've made for people with disabilities to participate in our services and make sure that they're done in a way that will leave people feeling not confused, not a burden, but will rather leave them valued and participating. Secondly, we want to try to offer them in ways that meet the needs that people have for community, for sitting with people, for enjoying, for what have you. Thirdly, we want to make sure that everyone that has a part in those roles understands the sacred part of what they're doing to help people have an experience of repentance and awe. Fourthly, we want to understand the potential triggering nature of the holiday times and take those into account in any way that we can, both in terms of preparation and in terms of having spaces. And lastly, we want to take these busy times when it might be likely once everything's over and we're just rushing to our next thing, and make sure that we're looking out, especially for those that might need a little more help, need a few more minutes that normally we'd linger with, but we forget. Now, I don't want anyone to take the stories that I've told today of indictments as indictments. I have spent almost every year of my life, except for the last few, living in worlds where everyone close to me was preparing to lead or manage a high holiday experience. I understand that it can feel like a monumental accomplishment just to get them off the ground, and it is. I understand that it can feel especially good to have come up with a solution that we feel like allows people to come in, and it is. But I also think that there's that moment where we say, have we really thought about what we're doing for the experience of the person? And it's hard on the one hand because, look, it's enough trouble just to find solutions. But it's also easy if we step back for a minute. Why do I say it's easy? It's easy if instead of looking at our wheelchair section and our line policy and our this and our that, we say, okay, for each person coming, when they walk in and they express their needs, do we take a minute to listen to what those needs are? Do we then look at the resources that we've made available in all of our careful planning and figure out what the best way is to do that? If we do that, then 9 times out of 10, most of my little stories wouldn't have happened. Right? Let's go through. If someone said, okay, we're just going to meet a person when they come in off the street if they're in a wheelchair in that long line, and we're going to tell them in no uncertain terms, we need to bring you to the front of the line so we can get you seated. Great. Simple goal, simple statement. I know, they know, we follow. Another usher is never involved. The moving thing is a little more complicated and is probably just a management issue. But even if we were to simply adopt a policy that says, hey, once someone is seated in a place and looks comfortable, I'm going to move on to the next thing, because my only real goal is to get them comfortable. I have no vested interest in whether they sit in Part A of the sanctuary or Part B. With the rituals, it does require a little more forethought. The touchlight example is one. Others will be individual, but it's really not about saying, how do we make this perfect for everyone? It's about saying, can we look at the obvious obstacles and get rid of them as we can so that everyone can have a meaningful experience of what we intended with this ritual. In Tashlich case, casting off sins. In other rituals, whatever it is that's attended. So it's sort of an approach and a mindset that once we take on the individual and the goal, becomes easy. Now I have to admit that although according to my clock I've only been speaking for 20 of the 30 minutes allotted, that feels like enough stage setting for you. It's not clear to me that you actually need to hear me drone on that much longer. I think what would probably be valuable at this point is for you to take these points that I've made, some of which are deep, some of which are glib, some of which are, perhaps unclear, because again, it's odd to do this without being able to gauge your reactions on the screen, and put me to question. You have this wonderful Q&A feature, ask me clarification, or we can depart from script entirely and you can ask me about particular challenges that you're wrestling with, because it seems to me that if you're wrestling with a challenge, then one of our other participants may be as well. And we'll expand. I think that's a better use of our time than more anecdotes from me. Joe, if you agree, then you're going to take over the cast in a minute and start looking at questions.
Hi, Matan. Thank you so much for your great presentation and really for the anecdotes which show and highlight so many of the issues that we all have seen or are coming to realize now, and all are working together to rectify for the future. At this point, we'll go into the Q&A like Matan said. So I am going to hand it back over to Matan. And Matan, we have 2 questions that have come in so far. The first question is, it starts with a thank you. It is from Karen. She says, thank you very much for sharing your perspective. It is very valuable. How can we best acknowledge that we can't comfortably accommodate someone due to the nature of our physical plant? Immovable pews, on an incline, and no area for people in wheelchairs, for example. Thanks for your response to this.
Okay, that is a tough one without dealing with the specifics of your shul. So I'm going to go with 2 answers. The first is not acknowledging your hypothesis as well as I might, because it's going to say, have you thought of every possible way that you might be able to bring someone in? But let's assume for the sake of argument the answer is yes, but I do wish to reemphasize that I really think out of the box thinking helps, even with immovable pews and inclines. Maybe there's not, but let's assume for a minute there's not, because I do realize that not every building can meet every need. I think at that moment, the very best you're going to do is humility. The very best you're going to do is say, well, this isn't right. We feel terrible about this. We want to strive as a community to change this. We can't right now, and then have an alternative option available. It may not be the best alternative option, but maybe it's complimentary tickets to another nearby synagogue. Maybe it is a streaming webcast of a service. I want to emphasize that none of these particularly are great options, but I'm acknowledging that it may be that in the short term you don't have a solution. Now the charge, the goad, because this is, after all, the time of reflection when we look at how we can do better in the years to come, is to say, I would hope that by a year from now, even if it has to do with looking at alternative spaces as a community, you've begun to seriously wrestle with the question of whether you do have an option in your own community if your sanctuary is manifestly unable to meet people in that way, because I don't think it's a great long-term place to be. And I think that saying there's nothing we can do a week before the holidays makes sense. Accepting 53 weeks later that there's still nothing we can do maybe means that we haven't, looked hard enough for some sort of solution.
Great. Thank you, Matan. We have 2 more questions as of now. Our next question is from Jennifer Steinberg, who is interested in alternative Tashlich ideas, and she is wondering what are some alternative Tashlich ideas that you have seen or heard of, Matan, and also I'll piggyback off of that and ask if there are any that you've thought of yourself that would have been helpful for you.
Well, I thank you for your piggyback, Joe, because I can honestly say that I've never done a search for alternative Tashlich ideas, so I can't say that I've seen a lot that other folks have done. But it's great to ask the question because we can literally devise one sitting here that shows the methodology of how we want to do this, right? Is the methodology of how we want to do this is, so what are the fundamental idea of Tashlich is that we take our sins, place them essentially on a physical object, and cast them forth from us, traditionally done with a bread on flowing water, but so many ways we could do that that don't require that. Frankly, there's no reason it actually needs to be an open water. You could float them away on a slip and slide, but you could take the opportunity to be so much more symbolic. You could take the opportunity to be metaphoric. You could take the opportunity to have interpretive movements that cast away sins, other actions. The fact that a bunch of Jews a long time ago came up with the idea of casting bread on water is great. But you know, what I want to challenge is the answer is, don't make me do it for you. The people sitting here on this call have a collective wisdom and experience that far outstrips my own. Let me give you instead the approach. Your goal is to create a meaningful ritual that is a physical symbolism of casting something away. Build from there. And, you know, if you're not feeling empowered to figure that out by yourself, I guarantee you get a group of 1 or 2 or 3 people together and say, these are our endpoint goals, come up with a creative way to do it. And I'm the one who's going to be amazed because you're going to send Joe or me all those great ideas that you come up with. And next year we actually will have some alternative Tashlichs that you came up with. I know that's very unfair, but it's really the way of it. We all have to work together to come up with ideas.
Thank you, Matan. And speaking to that point, any resources that you have that you want to share, anything you'd like feedback on, you can send to me, you can send to Matan, and we will also, we're happy to provide the feedback, and we will also post the resources and everything from this call, everything that Matan has mentioned, along with this video, will be live on the Disabilities Inclusion Learning Center located at disabilitiesinclusion.org next week and in the coming days, including our the previous sessions in this learning series. Our next question is from Ed Frim. And Ed says, hi, Matan. Could you comment on the importance of building relationships? Once you get to know each other, magical things can happen, and I know you have wonderful stories to share. How can we create the personal relationships that bring people together, both at home and in the synagogue at the high holiday time?
Thank you for the question. Oh, now I'm unmuted. Ed, thank you for the question. I think that the most important way that we create relationships with anyone is actually to come over and say hello. Now, I know that sounds really simple, but you know, you walk up to someone, especially at that big impersonal time that's the high holidays, you say, hi, Shana Tova. You know, if you do actually know them a little bit, you can comment on something in common. If not, you can simply introduce yourself. But there's other steps. That's the basic, and I don't want to overstate understood. But let's take the example of the doctor from my story of my first panic attack. Now, mind you, he was already a family friend, so that's not true relationship building. But let's assume that at the high holidays, because everything's so big and there are so many people, you may occasionally see people that are encountering a struggle. Maybe it appears to be internal emotional turmoil, and that's not limited to people with disabilities. The high holidays bring up lots of things for lots of people. Maybe it's a purely physical struggle. It looks like they can't find a place to sit. They're lost in their machzor. They're, whatever it is, it's a perfect moment to go over and say, Shana Tova, how can I help? Tell me about yourself, or some version of it. I think that relationship building is a combination of that which happens organically and that which happens with intentionality. But the part that happens with intentionality is that you look at someone who seems right either for an introduction or for help, and you offer to. And if someone appears to be either looking for support or friendship or just bereft or alone, is a perfect opportunity to go and introduce yourself. And for those on the call, since I don't really know who are spiritual leaders, it's also a perfect time to take note if somebody offers you one of the sort of bigger theological concerns, oh my, I have an anxiety disorder and we're talking about faith. Obviously, you're not going to have a deep discussion with them right at that moment. But what you can say is, I would love to meet with you after the holidays and talk about that. Not only will we help allay their concern, but that's the kind of dialogue that creates a longer-term relationship with the congregant, with the person having the issue. So I think that I don't have a ringer to be the answer to Ed's question, but it's really just, it's engaging people with the same will that we hope our movement of audacious hospitality is engaging everyone that looks like they could use some engagement. So that is my thought on that question.
Thank you, Matan. One question that I had, we all know we're getting close to the high holidays, and like you mentioned, some things, especially bigger things, are going to need to be done over the coming year to prepare for next year. But being that we have 2 weeks left this year, what would you as a self-advocate like to see done if possible? What tips could you give to those of us on the call and the people who will see this over the next week that you can recommend that we do in our congregations for this year?
Honestly, I think the biggest thing that you can do is that between this webinar and the other ones, a fair number of ideas, concerns, and opportunities have been raised between our presenters, our questioners, what have you. And so here's what I would always say when I come into a shul for the first time. Look at as many of those as you can and ask yourself the following 2 questions. The first is, do we already have a plan in place that reflects that? If the answer is yes, you're splendid. You've got nothing more to do. If the answer is no, don't just say, it's 2 weeks, it's too late. Say to yourself, is there anything I can do in the next 2 weeks to have some plan to deal with that? Maybe it's not the perfect plan. Maybe it's not the one that you'll use next year. Maybe it's not, the one that will be put up on the websites as an exemplar of how to do it. But I would say this, and I know it's not fair, but with all of the opportunities these learnings raise, address whether there is anything you can do in the next 2 weeks. Even to the first questioner who asked me about, how do we acknowledge that we just have an inaccessible space? See what options you can come up with in the next 2 weeks. Maybe it's nothing, but I don't know. I don't give up until the gates are closing myself. So, that means Yom Kippur is an option also, which gives us an extra 10 days. And some say Sukkot. So, it's a question of, really don't accept that you don't have a strategy in place for a particular thing until it's clear that there's nothing more you can do. Is that a satisfactory answer, Joe? since it was your question, and we actually get the dialogue because you have vocal capability on the call.
Definitely. Thank you, Matan. And I think it also really fits in with our whole theme for this learning series, which is that everything that we're coming up with now, all of these ideas, like Matan mentioned, all of the presenters we've had and the questions we've had, everything is working towards making our communities more inclusive for the years to come. So we're starting at this important point, and we're going to need to reevaluate throughout the year and keep implementing changes and making bigger changes and reinforcing what we're already doing. But as we know, inclusion is a continuous and continual process, and now is a great time to implement what we can and then build off of that foundation.
I really want to encourage you, since we do have still a good 15, 20 minutes together, this is your opportunity to pose questions. I know it's a little harder when you have to type them, but this really is a great opportunity to further discussion for everyone. So, take the opportunity and, think a moment on the stories, on the thoughts, on the ideas. And even if it's not related to the stories, the thoughts, the ideas, if you have a related question, now is a great time to pose it. Don't be shy.
I'm Rabbi Edie Mencher, and it's my honor to have Matan here, and so I want to make the best use of your presence. Matan, you are very generous in sharing what your experience has been to be a very active and learned member of many congregations where it may have taken you a long time to do this, but you speak up about what it has felt like to you to have prayers or policies that are either isolating or disenfranchise you in some way. And I think it's wonderful that we all tune in to hear and learn, but I'm wondering if you have specific ideas about how everyone on this call can gain the impressions and voices and wishes and hopes of people in their congregation who have either lifelong, newly acquired disabilities, how, if they are ones that they experience as stigmatizing for, and are not ready to come forward about, if it's psychiatric, are there anonymous, more public ways that this dialogue can be encouraged in every one of our sanctuaries and communities?
Edie, thanks for the question, especially because I think the high holidays are an excellent opportunity for this, right? Because you do get all of what I referred to a little earlier as the once-a-year Jews, but the thing is that maybe there'll be more than once-a-year Jews if you could figure out why they were once-a-year Jews in the first place. And so a great opportunity is to say that you will have various fora available for feedback. You announce sort of repeatedly from the pulpit that there are email addresses people can use with thoughts and concerns, anything you want to share. Did you feel welcome? Did you feel comfortable? Just to ask the question. I've noticed at some synagogues, and I love it, at the high holidays, they tend to have repeating themes. There are certain things they say towards the close of every service, and they're almost thought questions. They're thought ideas that. So you could just add a thought question where you say, did this High Holy Day experience speak to you? Did you feel included? And one of the things I like is that I don't usually characterize inclusion just as disability, so you really can mean this as a question for everybody. Did you feel included in this experience? Did you feel excluded from this experience? We would love to know why. And you provide email addresses. Maybe you provide a web link that allows it to be more anonymous. You could, in the days following Yamim Hanoraim, sorry, that one wasn't sent to the captioners, following the days of awe, you could send out a survey saying, we'd like to hear from you if you felt included, if you didn't feel included, what could we do better? Everyone will have an opinion on how the holidays went. Some will feel good about it, some will feel bad about it, and your task, your goal is to give as many ways for people to share that as possible in the first instance. But then you've got a second goal. After you've gathered that, you need to make it really clear that there's a process where you'll be listening to it and reacting to it. And why do you need to do that? In the first instance, you need to do it because, well, you want to listen to it and react to it. But in the second instance, it's an iterative process. If people that didn't necessarily feel comfortable speaking up right now see that the ones that did were listened to and reacted to, then when you do this again, 6 months from now or around Pesach, another thing we didn't send to the captioners, or anything like that, you will see buy-in where people say, gee, they actually do care what I want. They actually are trying. And I have to emphasize, and you'll see this as a theme in my work, it actually is an important thing to show that you're trying. It's as important as getting it right, if you will. Especially, this is where if you were to go and separately watch my liturgy webinar, you'd see the notion that people should care. And so I really think that that is part of the way to go forward.
I think it does answer it. I think that the vehicles that you suggested are excellent ones, and I might add to it myself to ask people to be very specific about prayer, the practices in the sanctuary, any gatherings that were afterwards, so that we really can learn in very specific ways and we don't end up with a yes or no answer, because that doesn't give us enough, but that's very, very helpful. And I'm going to turn it over to Joe now because there are additional questions. Thank you so much, Matan.
All right. Hi again, everybody. We have a couple more questions that have come in. The first one is from Rachel, and she asks us, she asks you, Matan, do you have any tips on how to train the ushers to be inclusive and consistent during the hustle and bustle of the holidays?
Okay, I'm unmuted again. And I do, in the short term, I would say really there are three pieces. The first is give them some tools. They don't have to be the best tools, but give them strategies for situation. What I mean, so for instance, in Boston, where I call home, through CJP, we've created a set of materials to help ushers through the high holidays. Now, I'm not sure that we've created the perfect materials, or we won't find better materials in future years, but the answer is that anyone that goes to one of our usher trainings has some basic sets of strategies. I think if you teach those, and I think maybe we'll get CJP's permission, since it's a fellow Ruderman project, to maybe make some of them available as materials to this webinar. We'll see if they'll do that. I think that giving those, what it really does that's important is not makes it perfect, but it gives everyone a starting place. And it's amazing how feeling like you have a procedure gets people to be a little more consistent. But then the second is to really sit all your ushers down and give them some version of what I said in my training. Remind them that what they're really there to do is the sacred duty of helping other people to meaningfully get to and participate in their Rosh Hashanah experience. And I really do mean that. The ushering, whether it's people with disabilities or not, is their one goal. So you say, we've given you some tools. These tools may or may not help you address every situation. But if you come from the situation that says, my goal is for this person to have a meaningful experience, I'm going to listen to them, I'm going to be attentive to them, I'm going to hear from them what they're telling me they need to have a meaningful experience, and then I'm going to be as creative as I can and engage my team and engage the people that guide and support me to figure out an answer. The consistency is twofold. It's number one, making sure people know, but making sure that people, secondly, that people have the same goals and approach. Does that make sense? And certainly, you should never have ushers that haven't had usher training. I think usher training is actually really important at a time like this.
Thank you, Matan. Rachel wrote, yes, thanks. She feels answered. So we appreciate it. And Ed Frim just added the respectability high holiday toolkit, which touches on this. And we also created a toolkit here at the URJ, and there are a lot of great resources. So we will share all of those along with this webinar. When it goes live, we will link to all of the different resources that have been shared, and we appreciate all the ones that have been mentioned and we've received. And we have another question here from Jennifer Steinberg, and she asks, thinking about triggers at the high holidays, would this be something the clergy could address ahead of time? Maybe with a prayer to help those attending deal with triggers, a liturgical trigger warning, if you will. And she wants to know your thoughts on that.
I will answer this a second. I just want to add one tiny follow-up thought to the previous question, because the problem is I get muted the moment you do the summation follow-up. Whatever materials you choose to use are the ones that Joe makes available. The key is consistency. Just make sure they're all available to everyone. Okay, now moving on to the new question that was posed. I would say that a thoughtful trigger warning, a thoughtful statement that these are difficult concepts, that we understand they're difficult concepts, and that we'll be able to talk about them and available to talk about them, wrestle with them during and after might be useful. I think what you want to be really careful about is minimizing the heavy nature of the day. What do I mean by that? It'd be easy to say something like, this content can be triggering, but don't worry about it. It's all just old medieval poetry or something, right? And yet that's not what we want to say. What we want to do is make sure that we say the concepts around Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are heavy and triggering. And we would be happy, in fact, we encourage you, should you find yourself triggered by them, to make time that we can explore them with you and bring you to a place of comfort. But it shouldn't be an overly dismissive type of warning, because the holidays are heavy, and we can talk theologically at another point of, you know, what we think about the themes of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, but I think that goes beyond the scope of this call. Does that make sense?
Thank you, Matan. Jennifer writes that she agrees. She wouldn't want to dismiss anyone's feelings, and that these are heavy times, and she thanks you again for your answer. It looks like those are all of the questions that we have for now. If anyone has any further questions, they can feel free to be in touch with us. We encourage you to please be in touch with us with any questions that you have. And we just want to finish by thanking you, Matan, so much for your wonderful presentation, sharing so much with us, and your wisdom and also your personal experience that we can all use to help our communities as we count down to the high holidays and beyond. So thank you again, Matan, and we wish you all Shana Tova.
Thank you, and Shana Tova to everyone. And you know, I am sure that you will all have what to wrestle with, but it will turn out well, and you'll create meaningful experiences for those that you're working with. And so thanks for taking the time today.
Thank you, Matan. Shana Tova, everybody.